Hi, I'm Dr. Helen Lacey, and I'm working with a team of academics on a new project which is set to investigate the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to talk to you first a bit about the project and about the background to the rising, and then I want to focus in depth on one particular primary source, which gives an unusual eyewitness account of the events in London at the height of the rebellion on the 14th of June 1381. So first I'm going to share my screen with you and take you to the project website. So if you go to 1381.online, you'll see our website with a link to our Twitter feed as well, at People of 1381. And this will give you alerts to any new publications or new discoveries that we make as we work on the project. So we're nearing the end of year one of the project now, and it's set to run for 3 years. At the end of the project, one of the main aims is to create a database of thousands of names of individuals who we find that are linked to the rising in some way. And then we'll be able to analyse this data to tell us more about things like the gender divide, about socioeconomic status, regional affiliations, religious identity, and we'll be able to map the incidents that are connected with the revolt and see how they spread and how they travelled across the country. Also here we've got tabs to things like our diary of events and people and places. So here we're regularly publishing new short articles about our findings of people and places connected to the rebellion. So in terms of the background to the rising itself, I'll swap to my PowerPoint. The 1381 rebellion in England took place in a context of revolt, widespread revolt across Europe. So we see revolts in Flanders, in France, in 1358, the Jacquerie is a major peasant rising, in Florence in 1378 to 1382, and then in 1381 in the summer in England. And this is one of the largest revolts we see, certainly in early modern medieval England. When we think about why the revolt happened, there are several well-known reasons why the revolt occurred. One of the most important historians really put emphasis on is the poll tax. This was the third poll tax, third of 3 poll taxes that were introduced, and these were attempts by government to raise money in a new way. So previous medieval governments had used income taxes, so they assess tax on the ability of the person to pay, and it would be a graduated tax based on the ability to pay. For the poll taxes was they introduced taxes at a flat rate per population, per head of the population. So poll literally means head in Middle English. So this is a head tax per adult. So by 1381, they were levying this tax at 12 pence per head of the population. And this caused resentment and caused widespread evasion. People didn't want to pay this tax. They saw it as unfair and punitive. And so people evaded the tax. They hid family members when the tax assessors came round in an attempt to bypass the levying of the tax. But this was the thing that sparked the rebellion, but there were other causes in the background. So there was, for instance, the war with France, which became known as the 100 Years' War. The English had been fighting this against the French, and earlier in the 14th century they'd had large-scale successes under Edward III's military leadership in particular. They'd seen big military victories and the gaining of land in France. However, by the 1370s and 1380s, the war with France was going badly, and by 1377, huge swathes of France that had been under English control were now ceded back to the French. And even by 1381, on the eve of the rebellion, there were raids on the south coast of England, which generated this real atmosphere of fear amongst the English population. We also see longer-term frustrations that were coming out particularly amongst the labouring classes, who had been under harsh conditions, particularly since the Black Death that had reached England in the mid-century, 1348 to 1350. This pandemic had decimated the population, almost halved the number of inhabitants, and it left in its wake a changed labour situation where, in terms of supply and demand economics, the peasants and the labourers could have benefited from their labour now being more scarce, and therefore you expect the wages and living conditions of those who survived to improve. But in fact, what the government did, and it was obviously influenced and representing the influences of the propertied classes, the government then introduced labour legislation to pin the wages at pre-plague levels and to enforce contracts between the employee and employer, which meant that people were not paid or not benefiting from this changed situation. So again, these longer term frustrations are in the background in the Peasants' Revolt when it happens in 1381. There's also a sense that those in government are corrupt. We see right at the top level, the people resent the influence of people like John of Gaunt, who's the king's uncle. The king at the time is the 14-year-old Richard II, young, and has taken the throne after the premature death of his father. So he's influenced by his uncle, John of Gaunt, and John of Gaunt is very unpopular in the country at large. And we see in the revolt of 1381 itself that the rebels attack Gaunt's property and the shield and images of John of Gaunt. There's also suspicion of corruption at the lower level. Government officials who are sent in to assess the tax in the counties are suspected of profiting from the tax and also taking some pretty underhand tactics in testing whether people are adults and therefore eligible for the tax. So, for instance, there are accusations of sexual misconduct against women who have claimed that they are prepubescent, but the tax assessors claim that they're women and therefore eligible to pay the tax. So all of these things are in the background to the rising of 1381. So in terms of the sources that we can use to study the Peasants' Revolt, there are particularly good archival records kept by government. The government is quite assiduous in keeping its judicial records, particularly in terms of prosecuting those who were accused of being rebels, as well as the pardons that they awarded to people as well. And in addition to that, we can look at the manorial records of the rising, and we can see that in the various manors of England, there's an echo of the Peasants' Revolt that carries right through into the 1390s and beyond, with these manorial records, recordings of land transaction maybe for people who were involved in the rising, then their land is given to other people in the manor. So really we can trace the after effects of the rising through many years in the manorial records. But the source that I want to introduce you to today is an unusual source and it's less well known. And it's a petition that was put forward by a woman called Marjorie Tawney. We have fewer records of women being involved in the revolt, and certainly those that there are have been largely neglected. So it's important, I think, to talk to you about this particular woman who was caught up in the events of the rising in London in 1381 on the 14th of June, when the rising really was at its peak and the rebels were going through London, burning buildings, attacking John of Gaunt's property. They were attacking groups of foreigners like the Flemish weavers and traders who lived in London. And there was real chaos felt throughout the city. And the rebels were trying to get to the Tower of London and requested a meeting with the king there to discuss their demands. And in the midst of all of this, we have this really interesting petition from a woman who is not herself an active rebel, and she doesn't want to get involved in the actual demands of the rebels themselves. But what she wants to do is present her grievances that she's had for quite some time, for a few years now, and she wants to use this opportunity of getting an audience with the king to put her demands to him. And it's actually unpaid debt that she's concerned about. She wants her debts paid, but she's going to take this moment of the rebellion to try and put her petition before the king. If I just swap to the website, you'll see that we have a record on the website of Marjorie Tawney here. And you can see Marjorie Tawney in the write-up of her her petition. And we have a link through the website to the National Archives website, where they have the record of her petition, and you can actually see an image of the writing of the petition itself. If you have a look at the petition, you can see it for yourself. It's written on a piece of vellum, which is treated animal skin. It's in reality, it's smaller than an A5 piece of paper, and it's written by a scribe, so a professional scribe, and it's written in French, in Anglo-Norman French. So Marjorie herself is dictating this petition or giving a close idea of what she wants to be written in it, and then the professional scribe is writing it up in Anglo-Norman French in order to be presented to the king or to his council. So what happens is, in terms of Marjorie and her story, is that she hears on the 14th of June the king issue a proclamation throughout London. The young king has seen London burning around him, and he issues a proclamation to the rebels to gather at the Tower of London, where he will hear their demands and he will give them justice. So Marjorie hears this, and she then decides to set out with her son, John, and her son, John Thorpe, are going to set off to the Tower of London and battle through the crowds in an attempt to put their claim before the monarch. So Marjorie's petition that she writes gives this eyewitness account of what she sees around her at the time of the rebellion. And she describes chaotic scenes at the Tower of London as crowds of people are thronging into the tower to respond to the proclamation and to attempt to pursue their grievances before the king. And actually, Marjorie says in the petition that the crowd is so dense that she actually fails to get to achieve her goal and to hand over her petition. Nevertheless, she persists, and she presents the document to the king's master of the wardrobe the next day, before the infamous meeting between the king and the rebels at Smithfield. So in the petition, Marjorie claims that her husband, who's died some years previously, had been owed debts at his death that then should be paid to her. And she claims that her husband was an old soldier, and he was one of the poor knights of St George's College in Windsor Castle. And she claims that the dean of the college of those poor knights, a man called Walter Almerley, was withholding the debts that were owed to her through her husband's will. And it's possible that actually her husband had fallen out of favour before his death, and this is why the debts are withheld from Marjorie. Interestingly, just before her husband's death in 1378, there'd been a visitation to the college where they inspected the old knights who lived there, and her husband Thomas and other knights were approached. They were called old knights who were much broken in the wars, and it was said that they kept adulterate Delilahs, to the great scandal of the college. So they're living in riotous ways, and they're keeping women who are not their wives in the college. So initially, Marjorie's petition meets with a positive response, and she's awarded repayment of the debts that she claims. And even the dean of the college, who was accused of obstructing her, is arrested for withholding the payment of debts to Marjorie. However, he then retaliates and accuses Marjorie and her son of being actually caught up in the peasants' revolt itself. He says that they were present at the murder of Simon Sudbury, the Chancellor, by the rebels, when they dragged him to Tower Hill and beheaded him on the 14th of June. So when she's fighting her way through the crowds trying to present her petition to the king, her opponents claim that she's actually taking part, and she's accused of being involved in the execution of the Chancellor, Simon Sudbury. And Marjorie's son, as a result of this, John Thorpe, her son, is arrested in Southwark by the Sergeant of London, and he's beaten up, and he's beaten on his head and other parts of his body. And then badly beaten up, he's taken to Newgate Prison, where he's imprisoned, and presumably because of his injuries, he dies several days later. At this point, Marjorie, fearing that her life in danger, then flees into sanctuary. The idea of sanctuary being that you can escape being arrested by fleeing to a protected space, the parish churches of England, or one of the permanent sanctuaries, as they were called, one of the big cathedrals, for instance, often had sanctuary rights, which would mean that you were protected from arrest for a certain amount of time, or sometimes for your whole lifetime. So at this point, when Marjorie's in sanctuary, she then has these 2 petitions drafted for her by the professional scribe that we were talking about, writing up this document and asking them to send it, petition the king and the council so that justice might be done to her. Marjorie's petitions are particularly significant in the role that they ascribe to the judicial aspect of the rising, with the king offering to open up the Tower of London to hear grievances and dispense justice. In Marjorie's version, a royal proclamation is made on the 13th of June, the Thursday, announcing that anyone with an action, title, or right to recover any debts or inheritances should come to the king at the Tower of London with their evidence, and justice would be done to them. Marjorie claimed that this proclamation was enough to motivate her and seemingly many others to risk the journey to the Tower of London on this time where London is burning around them and the rebels are killing people on the streets. Her case also shows how perilous this was. Her proximity to the group of rebels who beheaded Simon Sudbury means that she's left open to this seemingly false accusation of involvement in the killing. And obviously her son dies as a result of being beaten up and imprisoned by the Sergeant of London. Marjorie's insistence that the petitioners were invited to the Tower contrasts with the version of events given to us and often repeated from the Chronicle records. So, for instance, the Anonomale Chronicle, one of the main chroniclers of the Rising, he has the king and the councillors desperately trying to disperse the rebels from outside of the Tower and move them to Mile End, where a set-piece meeting would then take place between the king and Wat Tyler. It might well be that we need to reappraise the traditional narrative of events of the 14th of June in light of Marjorie's account. Marjorie's petition also highlights the part that women played in the revolt, and until recently this has been an underappreciated facet of the Rising. According to her petitions, she saw an opportunity to accuse her opponents of misconduct, and she was prepared to set out for the Tower despite the danger posed by the insurgents all around her. In the preceding days, the Commons, the rebels, had laid siege to buildings in and around the Temple of London. They destroyed the houses of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, set fire to buildings in Westminster and Holborn, destroyed the Savoy Palace, which was John of Gaunt's palace. They'd opened up the Fleet Prison and beheaded traitors to the king. Marjorie might not have been aware of the true scale of the devastation around her in London, but she must surely have had some sense of the risk that she took in setting out for the Tower. And her subsequent petitions accentuated her vulnerability. She mentions her status as a widow and her dash to sanctuary in fear of her life. But of course, we've got to remember that these are carefully crafted documents intended to elicit sympathy from the men who might judge her case. The outcome of Marjorie's case is unknown, but her younger son continued to pursue the 2 men connected with his brother's death. And in December 1383, the dean of the castle, Walter Ameley, and another man were accused of trespass and had to fight trespass cases against Marjorie's younger son. So hopefully that's given you some insight into the project and to the kinds of sources that we are finding in our investigation. So stay tuned to the 1381 website and to our Twitter feed. Thank you.